Interest rates are rising. When does owning cash make sense again? So right now, interest rates around the world are rising. And it begs the question, when does it make sense to have more of a portfolio in cash again? And that's going to be the topic of today's video. Before going into that, go over to adamfire.com, especially if you're an expat or a high net wealth individual, and see how I've helped people like yourself in the past. Now, interest rates are rising, as I mentioned, around the world, both in the developed and developing world. So it's got more people thinking whether it's a good idea to put more money in cash. Now, I think regardless of the economic conditions, it makes sense to have an allocation to cash. For many people, just having 3 months of savings in case something goes wrong makes sense. For business owners, it can make sense to have more in cash for obvious reasons. But beyond that, I would say there's a simple rule you can apply, or 2 rules. Number 1 is look at the real interest rate. That means how much you're getting in the bank minus inflation. And number 2, look at the risk. So for example, in the UK in 2007, just before the financial crisis, you could get up to like 5.8, 6% in the bank. And inflation was only at 2 or 3%. So you were making 3 or 4% per year adjusted for inflation, which was a pretty good return because the risk wasn't high then, because the UK's political situation was quite stable, at least for the next year or 2 before the global financial crisis. So there wasn't a big risk of depreciation or whatever, at least in the coming months, although that obviously changed in the future. So that's an example of when cash can make sense. If you're making 2, 3, especially 4% above inflation, and you're in an area where the currency looks quite stable, then it can make sense to own more cash. Another example would be when I was in China many years ago, the RMB was consistently going up every single year because the government was devaluing the RMB on purposely. It was keeping the currency artificially low for a long time, but then gradually they were changing that. So every single year, the RMB consistently was getting stronger because of this artificial situation. So people knew that if they kept their money in the bank in China earning, say, 3 or 4%, and they sent their money home, they could easily be making 8, 10, even sometimes 15, 20% per year in local currency terms because of this situation. Again, that changed obviously because then China opened up a bit more its currency markets, and now the currency is actually going down against the US dollar, or that's been the general trend in the last 5 years. So that brings me to the current situation. So I would say in most emerging markets, if not every single mid and emerging market country, mid-income and emerging market country, the risks are just too high at the moment. So for example, Turkey, the currency is obviously doing very badly. Inflation's going super high. So actually last year, the Turkish stock market was the best performing stock market during many of the months because local Turkish people wanted to move their money out of cash despite the higher interest rates because the risk was super high. Likewise, Ghana has just defaulted on its external debt, and many countries like Egypt are also facing depreciation risks. But what about developed countries? Now, I would say it depends what kind of developed country you're in and where the inflation situation goes in the future. So the UK has been a bit dicey recently, and so is Japan when it comes to the political situation and the currency risk. Of course, the pound almost hit parity against the US dollar last year before the situation stabilized for now. I would say the US situation is a bit more interesting because obviously people can get sometimes 5% in the bank now living in the United States. But in Europe, including the UK, interest rates are still relatively low compared to the risk you're going to take. So I would say if you're living in America, you could maybe look at these interest rates and say, well, we'll put a portion of our assets into these kind of returns. But in most countries, it's still much below inflation. In fact, real interest rates have gone down in many countries in the last year or two just because inflation has skyrocketed. So I think you always have to look at those 2 things, the real interest rate and the risk. What will be interesting this year, though, is it's expected that interest rate rises will stop and in some countries might even fall. And especially going into next year, that situation could happen.
Depends on every person's individual goals, how much money they want to invest, how long they want to invest. And I did not have at all the feeling from any bank with which I had contact with, that they were interested in these things. Whereas with you, it was from the very beginning obvious to me that you had experience in these matters and also were interested in what I wanted to achieve.
Anyways, I'm very, very pleased and positive to say that I believe I've picked the right one. The results in the last couple of years have overreached my expectations by far, and I see no reason why it should not continue. Of course, I can highly recommend him as your financial advisor for now and for the future, because hesitating is missing out.
So I'm investing a lot in the Middle East market, but the amount of returns I'm getting from there is very low as per the amount of returns I'm getting from the investment portfolio which you made for me. Obviously, the best result in market right now is Adam.